Hi, this is Jana. In this video, I'm going to go over some of the basics that you'll need to get through this class and begin using your camera. Part 1. Basic terms. What is photography? The prefix photo means light, and the suffix graphy means writing. So photography literally means writing with light. Photography is the art or process of producing images by the action of radiant energy, and especially light, on a sensitive surface such as film or, in your case, with your digital camera, an optical sensor. What is a camera? A camera is a device that consists of a light-proof chamber with an aperture fitted with a lens and a shutter through which the image of an object is projected onto a surface for recording. In simplest terms, a camera is an enclosed box with a hole to let light in and some kind of light-sensitive surface, such as photo paper, film, or a digital sensor, inside. In this class, we will mostly be talking about DSLR cameras. DSLR stands for Digital Single Lens Reflex. A single lens reflex camera uses a prism and a mirror to allow the photographer to see exactly how the image will be framed through the viewfinder. This mechanism distinguishes SLRs from twin lens reflex cameras, view cameras, and rangefinder cameras. Some of you may have mirrorless cameras, which have rangefinders. Those will work just fine for this class too, as long as you can shoot in manual mode and produce raw files. What is a raw file? A raw file is a collection of unprocessed data. This means the file has not been altered, compressed, or manipulated in any way by the computer. A popular type of raw file is camera raw, which is generated by a digital camera. Instead of processing the image captured by the camera, the data is left unprocessed and uncompressed until it is opened with a computer program. Raw files are much larger than JPEGs, which means they take up more storage space. Because they contain all the information the camera sensor can provide, they will look flat and muddy right out of the camera and have to be run through software like Adobe Camera Raw or Lightroom, both of which we'll get to later. For these reasons, it may be tempting to shoot JPEGs. Don't do it, it's a trap. You may be sorry later. So JPEGs are smaller, they take up less room on your memory card, but the quality is just not as good. And if you take a really fantastic photograph and you want to do more with it later and it's just a JPEG, you may find yourself really limited. If you need the immediate convenience of a JPEG, check to see if your camera has a setting that will allow it to shoot RAW and JPEG files simultaneously. We shoot RAW files because they have a wider range of possibilities than JPEGs. A RAW file has more information inside. There's more detail in the shadows and in the highlights, which means that more can be pulled out in post-production. A raw file will give you a bigger and better print. Here on the left side, you see an unprocessed raw file. So again, everything's pretty flat and muddy. The sky doesn't look so great. The leaves in the front are a little dark. But on the right, you can see what the same image processed by Adobe software looks like. So it turns out that there was a lot of detail in the leaves, and we were able to bring those up a little bit, and there was a lot of detail in the seed pod, and there was plenty of blue in the sky, all of which could be brought out of that raw file, but might not have been able to be rescued in a JPEG. Different camera companies use different raw file extensions. So if you're shooting with a Canon digital camera, you might get a .crw file. If you're shooting with a Nikon digital camera, you might get a .nef file. Even though the file extensions are different, the file is essentially the same. Part 2. Using your DSLR. How does a DSLR camera work? Here in this diagram, you'll see what's effectively a camera chopped in half so that you can see inside of it. So over on the left, you'll see the lens, and you'll see light coming in through the lens. That light travels all the way back where it bounces off of a mirror, which sends it up to a prism, which bounces it down and around until you can see exactly what is on the other side of the lens through the viewfinder. Here is the mode dial for the Canon 60D. As a student of this class, you're allowed to borrow a Canon 60D from Pasadena City College if you don't have a digital camera of your own. So that's why I've included the mode dial for this particular camera in this lecture. On the top, you'll see the creative zone. The modes in this zone allow you control over how the light reaches your camera. For this class, we'll begin in manual exposure mode, that M right there. Down at the bottom, you'll see the basic zone and full auto mode. So when you're using modes in the basic zone, the camera is making some decisions for you. If you're using the modes in the basic zone, the camera is doing a lot of the work for you, but you're also losing a lot of control. You may not be able to determine exactly how an image looks, and that's what manual exposure mode lets you do. Manual exposure mode also lets you shoot raw files. So on some cameras, like the 60D, if you're shooting in the basic zone using the automatic settings, the camera won't let you shoot raw files. It's as though it assumes that if you're using the automatic settings, you have no business using a raw file, which takes more knowledge to process. So we want to make sure that you're working in the manual modes, which allow you to control everything and shoot raw files. There are 3 factors that determine how much light reaches your camera's sensor and what your image will look like. Those factors are aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. The aperture is the size of the hole letting in the light. Aperture sizes are called f-stops. So if you're looking at a camera lens and you're turning the ring to open and close it and you're seeing the circle in the middle get larger and smaller, what you're looking at is the aperture. Next is shutter speed, and shutter speed is the length of time that aperture stays open. Finally, there is ISO, the sensitivity of the material, film, or a digital sensor, to light. This chart, which is also included by itself on the page that this lecture is embedded in, will hopefully help you visualize some of what I'm talking about when I talk about aperture, shutter speed, ISO, and their relationship to each other. At the top, you'll see aperture. The smaller the aperture, the more of the image you can get into focus, and we call that depth of field. So over there on the left, where there's the man with the mountains behind him and everything's in focus, that has a greater depth of field than the image all the way on the right side, where the man is in focus and the mountain is out of focus. For that picture on the left side, you'll see underneath the aperture is f32, so that's a small aperture. All the way over on the right, where very little of the scene is in focus, the shallow depth of field, there's a larger aperture, f1.4. One of the trickiest things to get used to in photography is the idea that the larger number, like f32, is a smaller aperture. It seems like it should be the reverse. The reason things are set up that way is that we're actually talking about fractions. So when we're talking about f32, we're not talking about a full number 32. We're talking about 1/32 of the amount of possible aperture in your lens. f2 is half the possible aperture. So if you're thinking of 1/32, that's of course much smaller than 1/2. So when you're trying to remember whether you're going up or down with apertures, making the hole smaller or larger, either try to remember that the number system is the opposite of what you think it should be, that f22, say, is a smaller aperture than something like f4, or try to remember that you're thinking about fractions. Underneath the aperture is the shutter speed, the amount of time that your lens stays open. All the way on the left, you'll see a running person frozen totally at 1/1000th of a second. All the way on the right side, you'll see the same person is completely blurry at half a second. And that's because a person can get a lot farther in half a second than they can in 1/1000th of a second. If you're shooting a still subject, like a bowl of fruit sitting on a table, you can use a very slow shutter speed because the bowl of fruit isn't going anywhere. But if you're shooting a subject in motion, you have to make a decision about how much motion you're willing to allow in your photograph. Down at the bottom is the ISO. ISO stands for International Standard Organization, which is a term that photographers have been using since film cameras were the standard. And what it means is that ISO 200 on your digital camera is approximately the same as ISO 200 on your classmate's digital camera, which is approximately the same as a 200 speed roll of film for a film camera. So the ISO is a standard way of looking at that factor for bringing light into your camera and onto your sensor. The smaller your ISO, the better your image will look. If you follow that chart along from left to right, you'll see that the image of the two people shaking hands begins to fall apart as you move to the right. The higher ISOs are making your camera sensor work harder, and the trade-off is that you're losing quality. Different cameras handle ISO differently, so one digital camera may look really terrible at, say, ISO 3200, but another might look pretty good. It's just something that you have to experiment with your particular camera. These three things, aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, are all related to each other. So when you're using the manual settings on your camera, you're making a decision about how you'll use each of them together. If you know that you want to capture this man on the top left and the mountain behind him completely in focus, you'll know that you need a small aperture. When you're using a small aperture, you're letting less light in, so you have to let in more light another way, and that might mean a slower shutter speed. It might also mean a higher ISO. So if you're letting in less light one way, you have to let in more light another way. If you're letting in more light one way, you have to let in less light another way to make sure that your image isn't overexposed. If you're shooting handheld, that means not using a tripod or without your camera on any kind of surface. There's a limit to how slow your shutter speed can go. Typically, I can hold my camera pretty still at around 1/50th of a second. Anything slower than that, like 1/30th of a second, and I begin to get visible camera shake. So I would want to use a tripod for that. Experiment with what you can do to hold your camera as still as possible and how slow you can go in terms of shutter speed. What you want to do when you hold your camera is brace your left hand against your body with your camera in that hand, and you press the shutter with your right index finger. And you want to make sure that when you're pressing that shutter, you're not moving the camera. This exposure triangle allows you to visualize the same information in a different way. So on the top left, you'll see that small aperture that says less light, more depth of field. And if you follow that line down to the larger aperture, that says more light, less depth of field. And you'll see similar things for shutter speed and ISO. This is just another way to look at the same information that we looked at in the previous chart. And here's a third way to visualize that same information, which is just text. The larger the aperture, the more light gets in. The smaller the aperture, the greater depth of field, more of your image will be in focus. The slower the shutter speed, the more light reaches your sensor. Faster shutter speeds can freeze action. Higher ISOs require less light to give you a usable image, but will add noise to the image, and we'll look a little bit more at noise at the end of this presentation. These pigeon photographs have been used in photography classes for ages. I looked at them in the very first photo classes that I took about 20 years ago. On the left side, you'll see an image that is almost all in focus from the very front of the image, the paving stones in the bottom, all the way back to the trees at the top, which is the back of the scene in front of the camera. In the middle, you'll see an image that is less in focus, but has more of the motion frozen. And on the right side, you'll see the least amount of the scene in focus, and the birds frozen pretty still. One really important thing to note about these three photographs is that the exposures are equivalent, so the results are very different. On the left, you have those totally blurry, unrecognizable pigeons versus the right side where they're clearly identifiable. But if you look at, say, the paving stones or the trees, you'll see that the amount of light is about the same in each image. So they're just as light or just as dark in each of the photographs. Up at the very top, you'll see a row of apertures, and below that, you'll see a row of shutter speeds. So there on the left side, you have a small aperture, which means more of the scene is in focus. So the paving stones in the very front of the frame and the trees all the way in the back of the frame are in focus, and you have a slower shutter speed to compensate for that small aperture. So because the shutter speed is so slow, the pigeons are able to move a lot in the time that the shutter is open. On the right side, you have a large aperture which lets in lots of light, which means you can use a faster shutter speed. And that's how you get the pigeons frozen. And there in the middle, you have an image that kind of splits the difference. It's a medium aperture and a medium shutter speed. So you get some frozen motion, some blurred motion. You get most of the image in focus, but not all of the image in focus. And when you are using your camera in manual mode, you are making decisions about how the image will look by changing the aperture, changing the shutter speed, sometimes changing the ISO in order to get equivalent images. Your camera has a light meter built inside of it, and the light meter reads the amount of light in the scene, tells the camera sensor whether there is too much light, not enough light, or the right amount of light, and communicates that information back to you so that you can make changes to your aperture, ISO, or shutter speed to get the exposure where it's supposed to be. Here's another look at noise. I just wanted you to be able to see it a little more clearly. On the left side, there's ISO 200, which is a slow speed for film. It has very little noise. And on the right side is ISO 3200, which has a lot more noise. The camera that you have may look better or worse at the higher ISOs. It's just something that you have to experiment with. And finally, I just want to show you aperture priority mode and shutter priority mode and where they appeal on the mode dial. Aperture priority mode allows you to set the aperture and have the camera figure out the shutter speed, and shutter priority mode allows you to set the shutter speed and let the camera decide on the aperture. So if you are shooting the mountains and you know you want all of it in focus, maybe you'll set it to aperture priority mode and let the camera figure out the shutter speed so that you know you're getting as much in focus as possible without having to manipulate quite as many settings. Or if you're photographing a bicycle race and you know you want the riders captured pretty still, maybe you'll set the shutter priority mode with a very fast shutter and have the camera figure out the aperture. For the first assignment, I want you to be working fully in manual mode so that you're really learning those relationships. But later in the class, you may begin to use aperture priority mode and shutter priority mode if you would like. This may feel like a lot of information, and it's also very different to hear me talk about it and look at charts than it is to actually be doing it yourself. Your first shooting assignment will help you figure out these relationships in a real way, and I think it will make a lot more sense when you begin actually handling your camera and trying to take some pictures. I also wanted to note that this presentation will be on the page as a PDF as well, so you can always go back and look at it and review particular slides if there's something you're curious about or have a question about. Please let me know if you have any questions, and please don't worry too much. We're going to go over how you do these things. You're going to do some assignments where you figure out how to do these things, and we will get you where you need to be. Thank you.